Hello, I'm John Powell. Our oral history today is with Norman Anderson, who was Speaker of the State Assembly for 3 terms from 1971 to 1976, served altogether 18 years in the State Assembly. And thank you very much for joining us.
Well, happy to do it.
Well, I'll start with the beginning. How did you get involved in politics?
Well, I always was interested in it. Going way back to the high school days, I was interested in it. I was on the debate team at my high school in Hammond, Indiana, where I was born and raised. And so I've just always been interested in it. My brother did also, although he was not involved in any political races. So I've always had that as a field of major interest.
How did you get from Hammond to Wisconsin?
Hammond is in the northwestern corner of Indiana, and it is the headquarters, kind of the head of what they call the Calumet region. It's an area of heavy industry, lots of steel mills, oil refineries, that kind of thing, foundries. And of course, talking about the environment, we rarely had any fresh air down there. The one thing that we looked for, our family, and I in particular, look forward to every summer, we would come up to Wisconsin to visit my aunt and her family, who had a place on Lake Ripley. And that was, the fresh air was just a godsend, and I made up my mind a long time ago that if there was anything I could ever do to help clean up the air, I would do it. And so that's part of it.
Okay, and then how did you actually move to Wisconsin?
After high school, I went into service. I served for a year and a half in Panama.
With the U.S. Army?
With the Army, right.
You were drafted, in other words. The draft was still, no?
No, the draft had expired. However, well, I think it may have still been in existence, but my brother was the one who urged me to enlist because of the GI Bill. That in the meantime, my father had died, and so I wouldn't have that family support for university, but the GI Bill would pay for my tuition and other stipends. And so I enlisted and took advantage of the GI Bill and came to the University of Wisconsin. I'd always wanted to come to the university here anyway. My brother had gone here, he was a graduate of the law school, and he's still alive at age 90.
Is he still in Wisconsin?
No. They're living in Minneapolis because 2 of their 4 children are there.
So you came to, you're one of the early, not the earliest, but one of the early recipients of the GI Bill.
That wasn't already during the war.
Right.
In other words, I joined the Army in late 1945.
What do you think of the GI Bill?
Oh, I think it's a marvelous idea. I think that we ought to, I don't know if it still exists for that matter, but I think that I've always felt that we ought to have some kind of universal service that everybody has to participate in if they're physically able. And one of the ways you could encourage that would be to have a GI Bill available for people after they get out of the service.
Would that be just for military service, or would there be other types of service as well?
As long as it was a public service of some kind. But I think of it primarily as an encouragement for people to enter the military service. I think it's a good experience for everything. My father, who had served in the Swedish Army before he came to this country. And of course, in World War I, he was drafted, so he served in the United States Army. In addition to that,
so he'd served in the Swedish Army.
Yes.
Then immigrated.
Then
got
was
drafted for the U.S. Army. Okay.
And he didn't enjoy it particularly, but he was always ready to say, 6 months in the Army will do you good. In other words, he felt that had beneficial effects on young men.
Is it good for the country to have a draft?
I think it would be a good idea for us to have universal public service of some kind like that, whether it's the military, whether it's a Peace Corps kind of thing. That's my own prejudice.
So you used the GI Bill to come to the UW then?
That's correct.
And what was that like? In 1947 or 48 you came here?
47, fall of 47.
And what was it like then?
Well, it was there were a lot of veterans. And of course, as far as where one could live, the university had leased a part of the Truax Field facilities, and at least that first year, that was my residence.
That's Truax Field is now, for newcomers, where the Dane County Regional Airport is. That was the military base during World War II. They built a lot of housing for the military, so then the university took it?
Yes.
So you were bused to campus, essentially?
Yeah, that's right.
And then did you move to campus later?
Oh, yeah. I'd much prefer to be within walking distance of the places where I was going to be going to classes.
So then what did you do when you graduated?
Well, I went to law school. I graduated with an undergraduate degree and then went to law school. And after I got out of law school, I started practicing law. On
your own?
Started on my own, and then I joined a law firm.
And I noticed from your resume that you served for a time as Dane County coroner.
Yeah, that was back when I was in law school still. The fellow who had been elected coroner, Joe Bloodgood, was recalled to duty in the Korean War. And so he had to there was a vacancy in that, and he had appointed me as deputy, and then I was appointed to serve out until he returned from service.
So you were sort of an interim appointment.
Yeah. I didn't run for the office or anything.
What did a coroner do? I mean, you're an elected official. You didn't have to be a doctor or anything.
No. The duties of a coroner are essentially to determine whether or not a death has occurred as a result of some criminal activity. In other words, you have to be satisfied that the death did not occur because of some illegal act. And so anytime that there's an unexplained death, we have to figure out what happened. And that we would, if there was any doubt about the medical side of it, we would appoint a doctor to conduct an autopsy, and so essentially that's it. It's just to determine whether or not any criminal act had occurred.
I'm a little, I guess being in elective office goes way back to the start of the state. Now it's trending toward having medical examiners do it. Is that correct?
In many places, yes.
That sounds more scientific. Having an elected official ruling on what really is a scientific question doesn't seem to make much sense.
Well, it's kind of hard to explain. I can tell you some stories about things that I investigated it, but well, most of the time there is not a problem. It's only when it's not. If you come to an automobile accident and the body is in pieces, you know what the cause of death was. When there's a suicide, I happen to think of one, you might say, humorous experience, if such a thing could be humorous. A friend of mine from law school, who was a fellow from Beloit, and he was interested in what I was doing, and said, if you want to go, if I would like to go with you to investigate a case, whenever it's convenient to do that. And so I said, okay. So I had gotten word that there had been apparently a suicide down near Stoughton. And so we drove down there, and an older farmer had hung himself in the barn. And he was still hanging there.
Wow.
And so I said, well, we got to cut him down. I've got to cut that rope. And so my friend got something to stand on and cut the rope, and I stood there to catch the body as it came down. So I did. I caught the thing, but as I wrapped my arms around him, he went, oh. In other words, it's his voice. By compressing his lungs, it had activated his vocal cords, and I thought that my friend would just pass out. He thought the guy was still alive, which obviously he wasn't, because anyhow.
That sounds. People who watch television and watch the CSI things today will say, you didn't have a whole team there and, take a million pictures and all of this kind of stuff. Isn't that the way it's done?
Well, not in Dane County at that time.
Was that a satisfying job, or was that just something you did because you were asked to?
I needed an income, and it didn't pay very much, but it paid something.
You think we should go to the medical examiner situation now?
That's a decision up to Dane County. I don't see any great advantages, because an elected coroner, whether he is a doctor or not, can appoint somebody to do the autopsy if an autopsy is called for.
Because I know today it's a medical specialty, doing autopsies and that sort of thing. Well, what decided you then to run for the assembly, or was there in between here? Are we skipping over too many years?
Well, Joe Bloodgood had run for judge and elected, and so I decided to run for that seat. He was my predecessor as coroner, and so I ran for it and was able to prevail.
For assembly?
For the assembly.
In 57?
56.
56 election, 57, 59 term, I guess it would be. What was the assembly like then?
It was an exciting thing for me initially. Of course, as a Democrat, we were in the minority. We were the Republicans controlled both houses and had the governor. Vernon Thompson was the governor at that time, and so it's you observe the way things are done, how business is conducted, and I had the unusual experience. I had read an article in the Department of Conservation's, it was then called the Department of Conservation, an article about the fact that we still maintained a bounty system for wolves and lynx in Wisconsin, and they were near extinction, and we should get rid of it. So I introduced a bill to that effect, and much to my amazement, it passed. Because very few bills introduced by minority members ever pass, at least at that time. But, of course, political winds change, and eventually we, as the Democrats, began to control at least one house and occasionally both houses.
So you eliminated the bounty on wolves and lynx.
And Canadian lynx.
As far as I know, both of them, if they weren't extinct, soon were after that in Wisconsin. Wolves later came back in.
We always had some wolves, but I don't know whether there are any Canadian lynx or not. I don't have no idea.
I guess they're still looking today. They're very rare. But then wolves in larger numbers came back into the state later, after you left the legislature, and I guess now the controversy is over having I guess they've authorized a hunting season on them as we speak. Is that a good idea?
If it doesn't, if it keeps the population of wolves in balance, okay. There is wolves exist by killing other creatures, and farmers are understandably nervous when there are a lot of wolves around because they can lose their livestock. And even if you have a compensation system to remunerate them for losses that they may suffer, they'd rather not lose them that way.
So you served, what else, anything else stand out in your mind from that 57 term?
Well, when you were in the minority at that time, all you can do occasionally is vote, but you don't have basically have virtually no input.
No duties either.
No.
It's an easy job in a way, I guess, except you have to run for re-election.
Well, and you use your own judgment on each piece of legislation, make up your own mind, and vote accordingly.
Was there the partisanship then, or even in the 70s, that there is now?
I don't think so. Just from what I've read about and heard about the last 10 years, ours was a more collegial place, I think. For example, I know that Gaylord Nelson, who was a state senator at that time, we had a good friend in the man who
Mel Laird.
Mel Laird. They would. They were good friends.
And that doesn't happen anymore, I guess.
Doesn't appear to.
Now, did you run for election in '58, or did you lose?
I lost, and I lost to an opponent who's had so many relatives in the district that all he had to do was get his relatives to vote.
Who was that?
Glenn Henry.
That was a seat here in Madison.
Yes.
So did he win the primary then as a Democrat?
He won the primary and then elected not to run for re-election, and I ran again and prevailed.
In 60. He won in 58.
Yeah, in 60, right.
And then he decided not to run again.
Yep.
That doesn't happen too often after one term anymore either, does it? That seems rather unusual.
Well, I never talked to him other than say hello, so I don't know what was on his mind.
So you ran again in 60 and won. What did it take to run a campaign then?
A lot of shoe leather, going door to door, and all that kind of thing.
Did you do any advertising?
No.
No TV, no radio, any mailings, literature drops?
I did some. I think I did some mailings. Yes.
But and your total that you spent at the time was?
I wouldn't have
hundreds, thousands.
Maybe I don't remember. I maybe $1,000. I don't know.
Not very much by today's standards.
No.
So what do you remember from that session? I know you wanted to talk about the 65 session, the environmental session. What happened?
That session, what happened was Governor Knowles at that time had appointed a reorganization study committee to make recommendations about there were too many state agencies, and so he appointed a committee, and a very good committee, very, very fine committee. And they made a number of generalized recommendations. The chairman of that committee was Bill Kellett, a paper mill executive, very able, did a wonderful job. It was a good appointment. And among other things, they made some recommendations about how the consolidation of water resources in the state ought to be accomplished. And their recommendations were introduced in a Senate bill, and they eventually passed the bill, sent it to the Assembly. And at the same time, when I say the same time, I mean the same part of the session, I had I had a number of legislative committees, legislative efforts that I was interested in. One was I had a constituent who got in touch with me and said he was president of the Yarra Fishermen's Club, and he said you should talk to Professor Arthur Hessler about the situation in Lake Mendota. So I did. I got in touch with, I didn't know Hassler, but I got in touch with him. And what he explained to me was that the village of Wanakee Windsor and DeForest they had a sewage treatment plant, but they were discharging the effluent into 9 Mile Creek, I think it's called, and that flowed directly into the Lake Mendota. And one of the reasons, in Hassler's view, that we were beginning to have some awful algae problems in Lake Mendota was the fact that this sewage effluent was coming from these communities, and said that what needed to be done was they need to be forced to join the Madison Metropolitan Sewage District, which in effect bypasses Lake Mendota, and their treatment plant discharges the effluent into what is called Badfish Creek, which then goes into the Rock River and then down and eventually joins the Mississippi.
That's where Madison was sending its sewage.
Yes.
Down the Mississippi, essentially.
Yeah. And that had happened back in 1955. And I don't know how that legislation was introduced or who sponsored it, but the 1955 session passed a law which, in effect, required the Madison Metropolitan Sewage District to cease discharging its effluent into Lake Waubesa. What I remember from that time was anytime in the summer, when you got close to Lake Waubesa, you began to get this odor, very foul-smelling odor, and it was covered with algae. It was so thick, the algae was so thick that on some parts along the shoreline, birds could walk on it. And so they, in 1955, they passed a law which required that effluent not be discharged there anymore. And ever since then, there has been a dramatic improvement. There still is some algae problem there, but nothing like it was. So I realized that that what we needed to do was what Howard Hassler was suggesting, was to stop the effluent from Waunakee, Windsor, and DeForest from being discharged into Lake Mendota. And so we introduced a bill and got it passed in the Assembly and sent it over to the Senate. Two other bills were that we passed, and I was chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, or the Conservation Committee, I guess we called it at that time. We passed a bill which required all committees, all communities in Wisconsin that were on navigable water zone the shorelands up to 1,000 feet from the water. And my good old friend Jake Boischer, Professor Boischer from the law school, called it the Navigable Waters Protection Law, because he had a lot to do with the drafting of that law. He also had something to do with a floodplain zoning bill, and that bill was introduced. Both those bills we ended up passing and sending to the Senate, and they were sitting in a committee and weren't going to go anywhere. It was obvious to me they weren't going to go anywhere unless I did something to get them out of that committee. I at that time I had a political problem too, a political problem. We had this bill that was sent over incorporating the Kellett Committee's recommendation for the administration of water law. And the Speaker of the Assembly, Bob Huber, didn't want to do anything that would give Governor Knowles something to point to as an accomplishment. In addition, the state chairman of the Democratic Party at that time was Louis Hansen. He also was of the view that he didn't want to give Knowles anything that he could run on. So what I wanted to do was to devise a way in which we could do all of these things. And so I talked with, and when you've got your own speaker is against it, the state chairman is against it, and the rest of the folks, the majority leader was lukewarm, Frank Nicolay, good, very, very good friend of mine. But I had one idea that I'm glad I followed, and that was I called my friend Jake Buescher. He was a good friend of Gaylord's as well as I was. And I explained to him what I'd like to do is to improve Knowles's bill. It's a good bill, basically a good bill, but we want to improve it. I want to put as amendments to the bill the shoreland zoning bill, in other words, the navigable waters protection law that worked so hard, that Jake had worked so hard to get done, and the shoreland and the floodplain zoning bill. But how do I get the caucus to go along? Jake said, why don't we call Gaylord and have him put some heat on, to explain to him what's at stake, that we could really improve the administration of water law in Wisconsin. And if it benefits Knowles a little bit, okay, but the benefits for the state outweigh that.
So
we called him.
Nelson by this time was a U.S. Senator.
Oh, yes. And so we called him, and he agreed, and he sent a telegram to Bob Huber saying that this was an opportunity that should not be lost. And as a consequence, and in the meantime, I was also working with the representative of Governor Knowles at that time was Wayne McGowan, a remarkable public servant. And he helped us work out the details of the legislation, that is, how to put it all together. And he suggested something else that we did. In the eventual compromise bill, we included language that said that it is the intent of the legislature that the administration of our water laws will eventually be under the administration of a newly created Department of the Law of Natural Resources. The Conservation Department would be made a part of that, and that was put in the final bill. And we did finally get enough votes. And and I left out one thing, and that is that my sewerage bill was still bottled up in committee.
In which house?
In the Senate. We had passed it in the Assembly, and I went to Tiny Krieger, Clifford Krieger, who was a good friend, the Republican chairman of the committee, and I knew that he had a bill that he was very much interested in, that was in our house. Not only in our house, but it was in my committee. And I made clear to Tiny Krieger that if he wanted that bill to pass, he also had to pass 718A, which was the bill that I had put in to clean up Lake Mendota. He said he would do that. So we made a deal. I sent his bill out. He sent my bill out, and all of it was passed.
I have to ask, log rolling is illegal.
Well, it may be illegal, but it happens all the time. And sometimes you need to do that to get something good done, as I found out.
What did Krieger's bill do? You know?
It had to do with funding for I've forgotten. Well, I could look it up in here, but it had to do with funding certain activities.
Now, Tiny Krieger, if he were still alive, might be called a liberal Republican. There doesn't seem to be any such person anymore.
Very few. Very few. Yeah, he was a very good state senator.
Now, you were in the minority at the time.
No, we were in the minority.
In the Assembly.
We were in the majority in the Assembly.
And the Republicans had the Senate.
That's correct.
Okay. So you can, or at that time, at least in the past, you could get along without gridlock.
We could, yes. Yes.
Now, in 1995, I believe, the Wisconsin Environmental Law Journal gave you an award. Among other things, they called you the first environmentalist legislator.
Well, that was kind of them. I don't know whether that, I won't, I'm flattered by that designation. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. I think I'd have to rank Gaylord Nelson ahead of me.
Now, so these bills that were passed in the 65 session, that's what you're proudest of from your time in the legislature?
Yes. Oh, yes.
And apparently they worked.
It has accomplished a world of good.
Some people today who may not be familiar with 20, 30, 40 years ago, looking at the Madison area lakes today, well, we still see that they've got a lot of algae in them. Sometimes they smell, but they've actually been improved?
Oh, it's hard to imagine for somebody that didn't see it or smell it what Waubesa was like before the effluent was diverted away from it.
Most of the concern in the Madison area, of course, is the big lake, Mendota.
Yes.
Is it improving, or how far do we have to go?
I can't say what else can be done other than what they're trying to do. On the technical side, I mean, there isn't any sewage effluent going in, but there is, of course, there's surface runoff that finds its way in. I don't know. If Art Hassler was alive, I'd ask him. But he's passed away by now.
So right now there's talk about controlling the runoff, surface runoff, which you're talking about, which is still the problem with the Madison Lakes. With today's political situation, is there a chance to get something more done?
I think politically it could happen. Whether the technical side of it exists, whether the understanding is there, whether there are practical things that can be done, I'm too far away from it to know.
The governor, the State Stewardship Fund, which buys land for conservation purposes, is named for Gaylord Nelson and Warren Knowles,
Yep.
Who were acquaintances, if not good friends themselves at the time. But apparently protecting the environment was bipartisan at that time.
Well, I don't. If it
is not now, I don't know.
if it hadn't been bipartisan at that time, I wouldn't be talking about the passage of those bills.
What else was big in the legislature at that time?
Well, there was, of course, the sales tax.
What was it? What was the level of the sales tax in '65? Was it still?
I don't remember.
I can't remember if it was up to 2 or 3 cents by then.
I don't remember.
But taxes are always a huge issue.
Yeah.
We're still wrestling with them. The legislature is. Property taxes. If you could write a bill today on the property tax situation, the tax situation, what would you do today?
Well, I don't think taxes are a bad word, as the Republicans seem to think it is. You have to use restraint, but as each opportunity presents itself, you have to make a decision as to whether this is whether it's in the interests of the popular will or not. I wouldn't be against a proposal purely on the grounds that it spent money. So I'm not up on what the local issues are at this time.
But apparently, in the political climate as we speak today, it's almost impossible to raise taxes, period. Is that?
Sounds that way.
Sounds that way. But it wasn't in your time.
Yeah, it's never easy. I mean, but you raise it when you absolutely have to.
Were people more readily acceptable of the idea of a common good then, or has the American attitude changed?
I would have to say, of course, passing a budget bill, for example, is always a problem. There were 2 or 3 times that I can recall where we essentially had to be in session all night long to work out the final details of a budget bill. So it's never easy. The issues change somewhat, but and whether my observation of the current situation in the legislature it depends upon reading the newspapers and seeing what these people are saying.
So you haven't been following it more recently? You
No.
don't know any more than the rest of us?
No.
You became Speaker then in '71?
Yes.
Was that, tell us about that election. How did that come about?
Well, Bob Huber, as I recall, accepted an appointment to a position, and I forgot what the position was, and so I succeeded him. I had been majority leader, and so it was a logical step. And then in the succeeding 2 sessions, I simply ran for re-election and won.
Did you have any opposition in any of these elections, or was it?
As far as the speakership is concerned, yes, there was always somebody who was willing to see how many votes they can get.
How many votes did you get the first time around for speaker?
I don't.
Was it overwhelming or close? Or?
I don't. Yeah, I think there wasn't any question about that. I think that next session I had an appointment and an opponent. I don't think it was a close.
What were the duties of the speaker then?
The speaker has, of course, he has the appointment of all of the committee chairs. He ultimately makes the decision as to how who goes on what committee. Of course, you preside over the body during the session. I always I enjoyed presiding, and I had prided myself on I know parliamentary procedure as well as anybody, and so I was, if somebody wanted to take me on, I'd delighted. Let them try.
Well, did the speaker at that time recruit candidates for the Democrats in your case, or raise money for other candidates?
You can't avoid political responsibilities, and so you do what you can to help make sure that all of that there's a strong effort on behalf of your own party to have a majority, and that involves some fundraising, but I can't say that is a major thing.
Today, it seems to be the major preoccupation of the office, and the majority leader of the Senate and the Speaker of the Assembly. It seems to be their prime job is to recruit candidates and raise money for them. That seems to be the overwhelming duty today.
It gives that appearance.
But it wasn't in your time.
No, I don't think so.
Were most candidates self-starters then? Did candidates come forward on their own, or did you have to?
Well, yeah, most of the people came on their own. Pat Lucey was, he had a lot to do with recruiting candidates. When he was state chairman of the Democratic Party, he recruited a lot of, his idea was to get, you can't win unless you've got a candidate in every single district. And so he did that. And of course, going way back, he was first elected in 1955. He defeated the incumbent Republican speaker in Crawford County. That's
Prairie du Chien.
Wherever it was.
Yeah. We've already done Pat Lucey. It was the 48 election.
48, okay.
Mm-hmm. And he defeated the person who was at that time the
speaker.
Wow.
The Republican speaker.
Yeah, I didn't know that. And so at that time, the Democrats were in a tiny minority.
That's correct.
And when you were first elected, they were still in a minority.
That's correct.
And there's a big difference between that and being in the majority, I guess.
Oh, absolutely.
As we said before, being in the minority is somewhat, one legislator told me I can now golf a lot. Is it that bad being in the minority?
Well, you just don't have it. you don't have any clout. You don't have any. All you can do is make noise, but that doesn't. Making noise isn't a vote. You can't win unless you have the votes, and so it's not. It isn't any. It's not fun to be in the minority, except that you can point out the weaknesses and stupidity of the majority.
Is it easier because you can just be a critic? You don't have to.
Oh yeah, you can say anything about anybody.
Well, now let's talk about the '76 election, if you don't mind. You surprising loss in the Democratic primary in the '76 election.
Well, I did lose. It was a close race, but I had managed to offend the Capital Times, and I did so by opposing the idea of opening up our party caucuses to the press, and in their view, that made me an advocate of secrecy in government, which is absurd. But that's they made it a point to criticize me incessantly, and that had an effect.
Should the caucuses be open or closed? We're talking about the partisan caucuses now at the Capitol.
Apparently they're open now. They weren't at that time. My feeling at the time was each party needs to get its signals straight, and if you open it up to the press, there are people who the conversations are going to be very much attenuated or directed toward the press instead of each other.
Now, the caucuses are mostly open now, as I understand it, but they can be closed for discussion of partisan strategy or personnel. And so even though the caucuses are open now, most of the real dealing occurs in somebody's office elsewhere or after they close it. Is that your impression?
Yeah. In effect, that's, in other words, that's essentially what took place before. They just don't. We didn't have separate meetings just to discuss partisan matters, strategy matters. So I don't know how they're handling it.
Now, you were defeated by an ambitious young man from Peter Baer.
Yeah.
Was this a complete surprise to you, or did you see the election coming at all?
Well, I knew that the Cap Times was doing their best to defeat me, running every single day. They'd have some little article critical of me one way or another. As it turned out, Baer then ran for the state senate, and then ultimately he had drug problems, serious drug problems.
Did you see the '76 defeat coming, or was it? It seemed like a complete surprise to most people.
Well, I knew that in a primary, strange things can happen.
Was it a low turnout, or?
I can't recall the extent of the turnout.
What was your feeling afterward? Was it a terrible disappointment?
Well, sure, I didn't run in order to lose, but I had, my law practice was adequate so that I had plenty to do. I kept busy.
So you had your law practice to fall back on. At about this time, the legislature was becoming, for some people anyway, full-time job. Was that a good thing or a bad thing?
Personally, I think it's a bad thing. I think when I was first elected, we were in session for 6 months, maybe at the most.
Out of the 2 years?
Out of the 2 years. And it became more and more time-consuming, although the actual time spent in session is not that great. You may be theoretically in session, but there's weeks go by when you're not in session. So I think of in the great state of Texas, they never have been in. When their session meets, it's about 3 or 4 months at the most.
Some states
for 2 years.
Some states have statutory limits on how long the legislature can meet. Would that be a good? Would that be a good idea?
Well, as long as it's not something that can't be changed, and I wouldn't think it could. I would think you'd always want to be able to, if necessary, if some emergency arises, you want to be able to call. There ought to be a way for the governor to call a special session.
But other than that, you'd favor a limit on the
I would.
days of session? Now, when you were first in the legislature, what was the pay? It was tiny.
Oh, something like $600 a month or something like that.
Yeah, this would have been 1957, but it was by no means full-time pay.
No.
No. And you didn't have any staff, really, did you, in 1957?
No.
So it was during...
What you did, if you were in the minority, you shared staff with 2 or 3 other people.
One person.
Yeah.
So you'd have like one person for 3 or 4 legislators.
Secretaries, yeah.
So during your time as Speaker is when the salaries were increased, when legislators got more staff?
It was one of these things that occurred gradually over a period of time.
And the trend continued through the 70s, but maybe that wasn't such a great idea?
Well, I don't think they accomplished that much more with all of that staff than we did in that period of time before then.
So every legislator now has at least one staff member, is that correct? Some have more than that. The Speaker, of course, has... How many did you have as Speaker?
And one assistant and of course, a secretary.
2 people.
That was it. Yeah.
Now it would be, what, 4 or 5, something like that?
I don't know what they have.
But you'd like to go back to a part-time legislature?
I think it would be probably a good idea.
Are people out of touch then when they're full-time legislators?
They're back in the district. So, in other words, it's a way of keeping in touch with their constituents.
That's what they spend their time on now when they're not in session?
I would think so.
If you had it to do over, if you were a young person starting out today or advising a young person today, would you advise them to get into politics, to run for office?
If they're really interested, yes. So in other words, it depends on the level of their interest, their dedication. What do they want to accomplish? Do they have goals in mind? If they have goals in mind and they want to get them done, sure.
But in this political climate now, you're asking for criticism, you're asking for being raked over the coals by an opponent, by the media. You have to raise a tremendous amount of money. Are these deterrents?
Sure they are.
Are they a bad enough deterrent that we got to do something about it? Or?
I think that we'll continue to have a legislature, and regardless of what the salary is, maybe not as high class, but I don't think there will ever be a shortage of people running for state legislature.
But are they quality people? Are they the kind of people
that's for each district to determine?
Have you been practicing law? Has that been as satisfying as being in the legislature? Or?
Well, I enjoyed the practice of law. I'm 99% retired now, but I enjoyed it. It has provided a good living to me, and I still go to the office occasionally. If old clients want to see me, I'll go and meet with them, but I'm not taking on any new business. I'm 84 years old.
Yes. I looked on some things on the website, Googling your name and others. Your law firm, Wheeler, Van Sickle, and Anderson, says a significant proportion of the firm's litigation involves defense of complex tort claims being, claims for money. This has been a big issue in the legislature for years, and many people say that they want tort reform. And Republicans charge the Democrats with being run by money from the trial lawyers, which are plaintiffs' attorneys, generally speaking. You're talking about being a defense attorney here. We didn't know that if you listen to the TV ads, you wouldn't know that Democrats can be defense attorneys in tort cases, I guess.
Well, I think what's confusing here, maybe skews that a little bit, is that at our law firm, we represent most of the rural electric cooperatives in the state and their state association. And one of the many things that has occupied our attorney staff is stray voltage cases that are brought against our electric utilities. And so I think that when they're referring to defense work, it's essentially that. But when you have something like 18 rural electric cooperatives, that gets to be a considerable number.
Have you ever been a trial lawyer, by the way, or do you?
Oh yes, I've tried a lot of cases.
Well, trial lawyers are the whipping boy of some of the Republicans, anyway. That it's you people don't want tort reform and all this litigation, explosion of litigation. We hear about this all the time.
Well, I don't agree with them.
Do we don't have a litigation explosion?
In some instances, yes, but as in general, no.
So the trial lawyers are getting a bad rap?
I think they're undeserving of what you've described.
You've been a trial lawyer yourself. Can you tell us about a couple cases? What is it like to be a lawyer in a trial?
Well, I think of, for example, I represented a man who was injured on the job when the big prison at Portage was being built. Something correctional institution. Columbia Correctional. He was injured on the job, and he was injured because of some careless practices of the employer, and as a result of that, a concrete block from a higher level came and hit him in the back of the head, and he was left with very severe injuries and extremely high medical expenses. And I tried that case for a week and got a substantial verdict of $550,000. $50,000 or something like that. But that's an example. But other things other automobile accidents.
Some people may get the impression from watching trials on TV, whether real ones, and only, of course, the most sensational ones get on TV, or the dramatized fictional ones. Does that give you any idea of what really goes on in the courtroom?
Well, it gives you some idea of what goes on, but it tends to be more dramatic on the TV.
You were not a dramatist in the courtroom. They say some of the great attorneys are actors, that they're great dramatists and sway the jury and all this kind of stuff.
Well, when you're making a closing argument to the jury, you naturally you want to try to create as much sympathy for your client as possible. When I say create as much sympathy, I don't distort the facts. You just point out the consequences of what they're doing.
Did you enjoy being a trial lawyer?
Yes, I'd say so.
So in summary, looking back on your career, you fairly well satisfied, or are there a lot of things that you would have done differently?
Oh, did I ever make mistakes? Sure, I made a lot of mistakes. If you haven't, as Harry Truman said, if you've never made any mistakes, you're not doing anything. So, no, I have had successes and failures, but I'm very satisfied with the practice of law. It's a very satisfying practice. That is, it's a very satisfying profession. It was for me, at least. I've done a lot of estate works, estate planning, workers' comp cases, all kinds of personal injury cases.
And looking back on your legislative career, how would you grade yourself on that?
I think I got some very good things done.
Well, let's leave it at that. Thank you very much. Thanks
Okay.
for joining us.
You're welcome.